The reason, if 10 years ago somebody had told me that I was going to write this book about the Afghanistan war, I would have been very surprised. And it's one of these things that just, I don't want to say just kind of happened, but the genesis of it was unusual, which is I was in the hospital recovery room at Sibley Hospital with my one-day-old son, Jack, and my wife and daughter. And out of the corner of my eye in the hospital, there was a report about this combat outpost in Afghanistan, combat outpost Keating, that I'd never heard of. And it had been attacked. 53 U.S. troops had been attacked by about 400 Taliban. And as I was holding my son, I heard about 8 other sons taken from this world. And there was something poignant about that moment for me that just grabbed hold, although I didn't realize it at the time. I wanted to know why anybody would put an outpost in this very vulnerable place at the bottom of 3 steep mountains, 14 miles from the Pakistan border. I wanted to know who these 8 men were. I wanted to know what it was like for a small group of American soldiers to face this seemingly insurmountable enemy force in this very precarious place. There's a lot of great war reporting being done by a shrinking pool of reporters over there, but for whatever reason, this story was not told. Army put out the results of its investigation, concluding that the outpost should never have been there. It posed absolutely no strategic or tactical value whatsoever. Case closed, end of story for the U.S. Army. Didn't really answer my questions. One of the other reasons I think I wrote this book is because I had been reporting on the war in Afghanistan, but I had been reporting on it from the comfort of, 5 blocks away on the north lawn of the White House, talking about Obama versus McChrystal and troop surges and 10,000 troops, 40,000 troops. For some reason, the story of the 8 men who died that day, or the 2 men who died, Tom Bostic and Ryan Fritchie, in the Battle of Surat-Kolay, or any other incident, for some reason that meant more to me. 1 person, 2 people, 8 people. And in retrospect, I came to think of those numbers that I used to bat around on the north lawn of the White House in front of the viewers of World News or Good Morning America as cold. Looking back, I'm kind of a little disgusted with the flippant way I reported those numbers. It's terrifying to be there. It's not fun. And the year where I basically from 2010, when I took on this project, until 2011, when I went there, not with President Obama, but actually went there, embedded. That was a year-long lobbying project of my wife that I was, I'm going to have to do this, right? I'm going to have to go over there. I'm going to have to. Well, I don't know why you have to go over there. You already went there with President Obama. It's not the same thing. I didn't leave the base. I was, and just that sense of dread. Well, nothing compared to what our troops go through was certainly a tangible reminder of just the dread that is part of everyday life for members of the military and their spouses. And I think probably after going through it in retrospect, I probably beefed up some of the home sections a little bit to write a little bit more about the wives and the husbands and the children and the moms. What it is that this country has been subjecting so many incredible men and women to over there. The toughest decision I had, there were 2 very difficult decisions I faced, among many difficult decisions, but the 2 most difficult I faced when writing this book was, how graphic should I be when I describe the violence? Because it's something that in addition to not really covering the war so much anymore, the media also, when we do cover it, we tend to sanitize things. It's a way that other countries do not cover their wars, but we in this country do. I thought, I really went back and forth, because it's a difficult thing to write about people's wounds when they're nonfiction, especially when they're fatal. Especially if you know that people that you have come to appreciate and develop affection for, the moms and wives and brothers and sisters of these troops, and dads, especially when you know that they're going to read it. Ultimately, what I decided to do was to, and I'm not going to read it any graphic thing tonight, so don't worry about that. But ultimately, what I decided to do was to tell the truth and not to be gratuitous and to hold back details when they didn't necessarily add anything to the understanding of the story. Joe Fenty was the kind of guy who always cared about his troops, always asked how they were doing. He could have, there's a one. Ross Burkoff, who I told you about, the intelligence officer, he had 2 days before Lieutenant Colonel Fenty was killed in a helicopter crash. Ross had run into Lieutenant Colonel Fenty in Jalalabad at the camp that now bears his name, Forward Operating Base Fenty. You might have heard about it. It was attacked by 8 Taliban suicide bombers earlier this week. This is not the part I was planning on reading to you, but it illustrates the kind of man Joe Fenty was. Burkoff thought, this is after Joe Fenty died, was killed in this helicopter crash, along with 9 other Americans, in the deadliest day for U.S. troops in 2006, which I did not even remember hearing about when I wrote about this book when I first started. I did not even remember hearing about this helicopter crash that was the deadliest day for U.S. troops in that year. Ross Burkoff thought about one of his last conversations with Fenty. 2 days before, he had seen him at Jalalabad just returning from the field. Fenty had looked spent. His hair was long, he reeked, and a gray film covered his uniform, the result of 4 straight weeks' worth of perspiration and Afghan dust. Regardless, upon seeing Burkoff, Fenty had immediately wanted to know about the Jewish chaplain he had arranged to bring to Jalalabad for Passover. "Ross, did you ever see that rabbi that I sent here for Seder?" he asked, even with everything that must have been going on in his head. The mission, his month-old baby girl, the killing of some ANA soldiers a few days earlier in an IED attack on the 371 Cav convoy, Fenty never missed a chance to inquire about one of his soldiers. And that was the kind of guy Lieutenant Colonel Joe Fenty was. So this is just one section that describes how Kristen Fenty found out about her husband's death. The wreckage of the helicopter, spread all over the side of an 8,000-foot-high mountain, was still smoldering the next morning when Colonel Mick Nicholson and other members of the brigade and squadron leadership arrived. Thermal imaging had measured the temperature of the crash site at more than 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Nicholson looked at his men, tirelessly combing over the hillside. They were filthy from weeks of combat and hours of rooting around in the residue of a burnt Chinook helicopter, covered with dirt and ash and the stink of aviation fuel, their eyes bloodshot, the black grime on their faces carved with streaks of sweat and tears. It took hours before all 10 body bags were laid out on the side of the hill, holding the remains of Joe Fenty, Brian Moquin, Justin O'Donohoe, Dave Timmons from 371 Cav, and Eric Totten, Christopher Donaldson, Christopher Howick, Brian Brewster, John Griffith, and Jeffrey Wycamp from Task Force Centaur, the guys who were piloting the helicopter. "Which one is Joe?" Nicholson asked. Someone pointed to his friend. Nicholson put his hand on Fenty's body, prayed and cried. From a nearby mountaintop, Major Timmons phoned his wife Gretchen on his satellite phone. He was choking up. Nicholson had given Timmons permission to violate protocol and tell Gretchen about Joe Fenty's death in order to get her to Kristen Fenty's side as soon as possible. Military spouses were required to fill out family readiness group forms on which they listed their closest friends. Gretchen Timmons was one of Kristen's contacts. "We've had a terrible accident," Timmons informed his wife through tears. "Joe's dead. He told her that he needed her to be strong. He needed her help." Gretchen was staying with their 2 small children at Timmons' parents' house in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. They'd just returned from Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. It was the middle of the night. Timmons told his wife that she needed to get back home to Fort Drum as soon as possible. She had to be there for Kristen. Early the next morning, Gretchen jumped into her car with her kids and her mother-in-law and drove the 5 hours to Fort Drum. After dropping off her family at home, she headed over to the Fentys. She was shaking as she rang the doorbell. Kristen answered the door cheerily, holding her month-old baby girl, Lauren. She was surprised to see Gretchen there. She knew she was supposed to be helping her in-laws with a yard sale in Pennsylvania and then going to a wedding. "What's up?" Kristen asked, friendly, happy. Gretchen was stunned. Kristen didn't know. I don't know. Hey," Gretchen fumbled. They were close friends, so Gretchen made up an excuse about needing to have some time away from her family after their vacation, and the two women spent the rest of the day together. Kristen was putting together care packages for her husband, placing toiletries, snacks, and some athletic gear, elbow pads, and jockstraps in boxes that would never reach their intended recipient. Gretchen seemed distracted. She wouldn't look Kristen in the eye. She picked up a pen and doodled on a notepad. At one point, Gretchen herself began to wonder if the conversation with her husband the night before had ever really happened, or if she had just dreamt it. They took care of the baby, talked about their families, and drank some wine. No one came to the door to tell Kristen what Gretchen couldn't tell her, the information that it would be a violation of military protocol for her to share with her friend. They watched cable news. A helicopter had gone down in Afghanistan, and all 10 soldiers aboard had been killed. A U.S. military spokesman said that the crash had not been the result of an enemy attack. Gretchen kept her mouth shut. Kristen began to suspect something, so she called the rear detachment commander to find out more about the helicopter crash. His wife answered. She seemed hesitant to talk, but Kristen still wouldn't let herself make the leap. Around midnight, Gretchen left Kristen's house, drove home, and woke up her mother-in-law. She still doesn't know, she told her. Gretchen Timmons got up early the next morning before 7 and went over to Kristen's again. Kristen was in her pajamas, holding Lauren when she answered the door. She still didn't know. "Hey, how are you doing? I got biscotti, but I don't have any coffee," Gretchen explained. Now, for Kristen, that didn't add up. Gretchen never forgot anything. And while having coffee with a friend before 7 wasn't that unusual for military wives, Gretchen always hit the gym first thing in the morning. But again, Kristen pushed her suspicions away, figuring her friend was nervous about the news of the crash. She let her in. A pot was already brewing. Official notification had been delayed because the recovery and identification of the men's bodies had taken some time. Fenty's remains were among the last to be found. He had been strapped into the inner cockpit area, which had burned red hot for hours after the crash. There wasn't much of him left. "Gretchen, I know I'm not supposed to ask this, but was it Joe?" Kristen asked. "Hey, I'm just a wife," Gretchen said. Kristen heard something at the screen door. Maybe that's just the heater clicking on, she thought to herself. Through the top panes of the glass and wood door, she saw that the screen door was swinging open. Maybe that's just the wind blowing the door, thought Kristen. No, someone was at the door. She opened it. So that's a section of the book that was painful to write, but I think vividly describes what a lot of people in this country go through every week, and we don't necessarily cover it. And when I say we, I mean me and the media don't necessarily cover it as much as we should. And the American people, all of you accepted, of course, don't necessarily want to hear about it. But these people are doing important things and sacrificing a lot for us. No strategic or tactical value whatsoever. Case closed, end of story for the U.S. Army. Didn't really answer my questions. One of the other reasons I think I wrote this book is because I had been reporting on the war in Afghanistan, but I had been reporting on it from the comfort of, 5 blocks away on the north lawn of the White House, talking about Obama versus McChrystal and troop surges and taken from this world. And there was something poignant about that moment for me that just grabbed hold, although I didn't realize it at the time. I wanted to know why anybody would put an outpost in this very vulnerable place at the bottom of 3 steep mountains, 14 miles from the Pakistan border. I wanted to know who these 8 men were. I wanted to know what it was like for one-day-old son Jack and my wife and daughter. And out of the corner of my eye in the hospital, there was a report about this combat outpost in Afghanistan, combat outpost Keating, that I'd never heard of. And it had been attacked. 53 U.S. troops had been attacked by about 400 Taliban. And as I was holding my son, I heard about 8 other sons, a small group of American soldiers to face this seemingly insurmountable enemy force in this very precarious place. There's a lot of great war reporting being done by a shrinking pool of reporters over there, but for whatever reason, this story was not told. Army put out the results of its investigation, concluding that the outpost should never have been there. It posed absolutely. The reason If 10 years ago somebody had told me that I was going to write this book about the Afghanistan war, I would have been very surprised. And it's one of these things that just, I don't want to say it just kind of happened, but the genesis of it was unusual, which is I was in the hospital recovery room at Sibley Hospital with my wife.